Welcome to Pop Quiz again. Guess the opposite word and test your logic from 100 levels. Good luck. Let's start. What this opposite of abstraction? Concrete. What this opposite of all? Non. What this opposite of young? Old. What this opposite of win? Lose. What this opposite of vertical? Horizontal. What this opposite of true? False. What this opposite of thick? Thin. What this opposite of alive? Dead. What this opposite of always? Never. What this opposite of amuse? Bore. What this opposite of ancient? Modern. What this opposite of angel? Devil. What this opposite of animal? Human. What this opposite of annoy? Satisfy. What this opposite of approve? Reject. What this opposite of save? Spend. What this opposite of scarce? Abundant. What this opposite of safe? Dangerous. What this opposite of rural? Urban. What this opposite of rigid? Flexible. What this opposite of quiet? Loud. What this opposite of Cupaqua? Transparent. What this opposite of private? Public. What this opposite of polite? Rude. What this opposite of permit? Forbid. What this opposite of permanent? Temporary. What this opposite of peace? War. What this opposite of arrest? Free. What this opposite of arrive? Leave. What this opposite of ask? Answer. What this opposite of attic? Cellar. What this opposite of autumn? Spring. What this opposite of backward? Forward. What this opposite of beautiful? Ugly. What this opposite of before? After. What this opposite of strong? Weak. What this opposite of shout? Whisper. What this opposite of optimistic? Pessimistic. What this opposite of on? Off. What this opposite of obscure? Clear. What this opposite of morning? Evening. What this opposite of majority? Minority. What this opposite of long? Short. What this opposite of liquid? Solid. What this opposite of long? Short. What this opposite of light? Heavy. What this opposite of left? Right. What this opposite of laugh? Cry. What this opposite of inside? Outside. What this opposite of hot? Cold. What this opposite of big? Small. What this opposite of bottom? Top. What this opposite of boy? Girl. What this opposite of hide? Show. What this opposite of hard? Soft. What this opposite of generous? Stingy. What this opposite of full? Empty. What this opposite of friend? Enemy. What this opposite of fresh? Bold. What this opposite of brave? Cowardly. What this opposite of break? Fix. What this opposite of bright? Dark. What this opposite of broad? Narrow. What this opposite of calm? Excited. What this opposite of careful? Careless. What this opposite of careful? Destroy. What this opposite of fragile? Sturdy. What this opposite of follow? Lead. What this opposite of forbid? Allow. What this opposite of careless? Careful. What this opposite of catch? Miss. What this opposite of ceiling? Floor. What this opposite of clean? Dirty. What this opposite of clever? Stupid. What this opposite of open? Closed. What this opposite of complicated? Simple. What this opposite of cooked? Raw. What this opposite of floor? Ceiling. What this opposite of flat? Hilly. What this opposite of fix? Break. What this opposite of finish? Start. What this opposite of find? Lose. What this opposite of few? Many. What this opposite of fast? slow. What this opposite of FAR? Near. What this opposite of expand? Contract. What this opposite of exclude? Include. What this opposite of excited? Hello, calm. What this opposite of even? Odd. What this opposite of dangerous? Safe. What this opposite of deep? Shallow. What this opposite of deny? Admit. What this opposite of dissent? Assent. What this opposite of equal? Different. What this opposite of entrance? Exit. What this opposite of enter? Leave. What this opposite of early? Late. What this opposite of DRY? WET. What this opposite of double? Half. What this opposite of different? Similar. How many answer get you right? Comment down and subscribe our channel to watch next.